How's it going there, everybody, and welcome to episode 167 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is one that has been requested on a few occasions, and we're talking about the subject of plants for shaded areas. So I suppose we've all often heard the term right plant, right place, and it couldn't be more true when you're dealing with a shaded area. So I suppose to cover that, whether we're talking about dry shade or I suppose, the more forest-like damp shade, well then, who better to talk about it than Mike Keep from Shady Plants. So Mike's company, Shady Plants, that's what they specialize in, is plants for shaded areas. And they're a mail order company based in County Waterford. So it's going to be interesting. And as I say, lots of people struggle with shaded areas. So Mike, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
Oh, thank you. That's
I'm sure you've come across it because you do all the plant fairs, but shaded areas is definitely an area that people struggle with. And I suppose if they can get it right, they can look spectacular. But it is an area that people definitely struggle with, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the problems with shade, of course, there are so many different types of shade.
Yeah.
You have your kind of typical sort of woodland type shade, which is very different from, say, your typical urban type of shade, where you can get sort of like no sun at all, even for the winter. So yeah, all different challenges, but there's always a plant for each particular area.
Yeah, I suppose that's the good news, is that there is always a plant for it. We might kind of break it down a little bit. Before we do that, we'll talk about the various types of areas and maybe some suitable plants for that. But before we do, just tell us a little bit about your nursery. You're completely specializing in shady plants, so just tell us a little bit about that, and I suppose the history of the nursery and yourself in gardening.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, for myself, I kind of started off in a tree nursery, and this is back in England. And then when I moved over to Ireland, worked in a large wholesaler, doing shrubs, trees, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we came to the big crash, sort of just before that, when everything kind of changed, everything was upended. And I was thinking there's nobody really doing good hardy ground ferns.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get against like the tree ferns, which I don't particularly like myself, but the ground ferns, nobody was doing them. We had real trouble sourcing them for different projects.
Okay.
So as the circumstances happened there during the crash then, so set up the nursery and just specializing in those particular plants, which we found difficult to source. So hardy ground ferns, that was the mainstay of the business for some time.
Perfect.
And so recently, I mean, most of the stuff was going to the UK.
Okay.
But Brexit happened, that was like pretty much 90% of the market gone. So we've kind of specialized, we're kind of diversified a wee bit now. So we're doing lots of different shade-loving foliage plants. So you think about your heucheras, your hostas especially. Again, getting a good range of hostas is very difficult in this country. So.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots to talk about straight away. But I saw on your website earlier you have about 60 varieties of hosta, which is pretty incredible because, as you say, if you look in your typical garden center, you'll probably see maybe anything between 4 and 8, but not too much more than that. If you're lucky, yeah. But you have 60 varieties, and I know there is a couple of people. I have one friend that collects them, and I'd say you're a dream nursery for somebody like that. But 60 is a very good collection.
Yeah, it's just trying to get different varieties from and trying to make the really good garden worthy types. Ones that are pretty reasonably easy to grow.
Yeah.
So there'll be a few of the kind of the smaller ones, and then onto the really large ones, like the large big leaves, that sort of size, and humongous ones.
I found out for the first time last year that they're edible. I didn't know that.
I've never eaten them.
I've never eaten them either, and to be honest, I've seen people eating them. We've on the podcast somebody has talked about that, but I've never chanced it, and I do have hostas here, but I've never chanced eating one. But yeah, apparently they're edible. Yeah, the leaves.
I'm sure in America there's some kind of like funkier appreciation society.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
They share recipes and stuff.
I didn't realize that you were originally sending a lot of your stock back to the UK. I didn't know that.
By mail order. Yeah, that was easily the biggest part of the business at that stage. Yeah.
Wow. So that had to be in a big change then. Obviously, Brexit would have had huge implications there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's
Well,
just pretty much just totally wiped it out, really. But
and
in many
so,
ways, it means now, in some ways, the nursery is a bit more fun now.
right.
So we're doing plant fairs a lot more,
Yeah.
so you get to meet more people, and so yeah. So from a more of kind of a solitary existence, it's quite fun then doing the
Very
plant
good.
fairs.
And this year, I'm not sure the schedule, but I have seen the schedule. There's a lot of plant fairs this year. This year it seems to be like a complete program, and I think for you, one that must be exciting is Mount Congreve is on this year, and obviously with the revamp in the gardens, I'd say that's an exciting one for you because it's local.
Absolutely, I really can't wait to see what they've done there. They
Yeah.
spent all the money there, and it's I mean, beforehand it was an absolutely fabulous garden to visit. I mean, especially in the coming weeks now when you get in the azaleas, the rhodos, and etc. and flower. But that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
Fabulous connection there.
Yeah, it's like I was in that garden years ago, like when it was in its sort of when it was looking its best, and then I went to visit. I was actually staying not too far from where your nursery is on holidays during one of the lockdowns, and we went to visit Mount Congreve, and it had got, it was nowhere near what it had been previously, and I've seen some pictures recently of the revamp. So yeah, definitely looking forward to it. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, the plant fairs, when is that? I think it's in April, isn't it? Yeah, so mid-April.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So yeah, that'd be one to look forward to.
For sure. Right. So in terms of shady plants, obviously, as you said, there is different types of shade. So maybe we'll kind of step into the end gardener's shoes here, or your customer's shoes, so to speak. And dry shade is the one that I know people struggle the most with. Then obviously you have damp shade, sort of foresty type setting. And as you said, you have the shade that you now get in certain portions or side entrances of a lot of the modern housing estates. So maybe we'll kind of cover them. And if there's another type of shade that I've missed out on as well, be sure to throw that one in as well.
Yeah, okay. We'll kind of start there at the deep end, I think. We're kind of like the dry shade.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's different types of dry shade. If you think about the worst type of dry shade, you're looking sort of under conifers, pretty much. I mean, if you have a sort of like a number of them, the ground underneath it, hardly anything is going to grow well there. You might get a few ivies that might kind of like scrape a living there, survive. You can get some ferns to survive there, but the preparation is the key for them.
Okay.
And it could take a little while for them to get established in there. But if you get very, very little light, then it's really a losing battle with that. That's the extreme. So when you think about your conifers now, that's the real extreme. The ferns which might do well there, if any fern will survive, these will be things like your male ferns.
Okay.
So Droptis filix max, Droptis affinis.
Okay.
They're pretty much the choice for that particular type of shade. And then when you get the other dry shade, which would be your kind of deciduous plant, deciduous tree shade. So beeches, again, sort of one of the problems because they're very hungry.
Okay, yeah.
But you can get plants to survive there because they're going to get some winter. So at least they get some kind of light just to try and keep them going through the year. So they're kind of like, that's the kind of the extremes of it.
Yeah. If we went back to the conifer situation there for a second, and thankfully we don't have the situation anymore that we had, say, 25, 30 years ago, where all gardens were planted around the edge with Lelandis typically at that time, and it resulted in a very shaded, very dry back garden. At the off chance that someone's still in that position, you said ground preparation is key.
Exactly. Yeah.
What are you talking about ground preparation wise? What are you looking to do there?
Yeah, what you want to try and do is clear a root ball size, just somewhere you can probably plant in. And generally, the smaller size plants for planting, like your 9-centimeter pots, do much better than say the larger size.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So kind of hold plenty of organic matter in there, anything to help retain moisture. And then a really good tip is to fill the hole with water before planting, and just let that drain through. Yeah. And then sort of put your fern in, plant it, not too deeply. Use the compost as the guide, because you don't want to cover the crowns up. And then give them another really good water again.
Okay.
Really good soaking. And then if you've got some organic mulch or something around it, just kind of put that around the fern. But again, try to keep the crown clear as much as you can. And don't water it again until if it starts wilting, then water it. But don't keep watering. Don't try the little and often routine there, because you're basically keeping the water at the surface. You want the roots to go down. And that's one reason why ferns are so good at this, is the roots grow quite quickly.
Okay. So you want the plant to work a little bit.
Of a spot very, very quickly.
Yeah.
They can be quite contained. If you take see a fern in the wall, for instance, there can be very little there. The roots are stable. As soon as you plant them into the ground, the roots go very, very quickly.
Okay. So that makes sense. You're making them work a little bit, because they're going into they're going into a tough environment. So you don't want to give it to them too easy at the start.
Exactly. There's water there, but it's down there, and the roots have got to go down and find it. Okay, and especially when you're fighting against like a large tree or something like that, it can take a little while.
Okay. So in a situation like that, you're looking at mostly ferns, and maybe as you come out from the trees or the hedge or whatever it is, you might be able to get maybe, I presume, the likes of your hostas and so on. As you come away from the hedge a bit, you might be able to get a little bit more in, would you? Yeah,
as you're coming away, sort of say now your tyrellas, which are lovely kind of sort of heuchera type plant, but they're really good at trailing as well. So as long as there's kind of you're out of a range shadow, then they'll do pretty well there.
Okay.
But again, other ferns as well. You're opening up a lot more ferns. So then you can go into kind of many of the different polysticums, which got lovely, mostly evergreen fronds, and they'll do quite well in the quite dry, not bone dry, if you like, but just that kind of the dryish sort of soil. And so as you kind of get away from the trees, then you can put more different ferns in. And then hostas can do. I'd kind of wait for those a wee bit more, where the soil is, it does get moist anyway. Certainly a couple of times during the year.
Okay, perfect. And the next scenario of dry shade, where you have deciduous trees, I'm thinking personally on this one, I have a grove of about 6 Betula jacquemonti, and there was a nice sort of planted area underneath it, but because the trees went in small, but now that's the roots stay so high on the jacquemontis.
They do,
that it's really difficult. So obviously there is, because they're deciduous trees, there is light getting in at certain stages, and it's a funny spot, because one part of it is bone dry shade directly under them, but in another corner of it, it's shade, but it's really damp because it's at the corner of a field, so water drains to there. So I need a bit of a mix for this corner. What way would I go with this?
Okay, I'm going to start then with the dry part of some of the really good ferns there. For birch, the Polysticum setiferum, which is the native shield fern, soft shield fern. Yeah. But there's some lovely varieties of that as well, like Herrenhausen, which has kind of not quite horizontal, but they're sort of like arching fronds like that. And they're kind of quite nicely dissected, very attractive. And they'll grow really well in a condition like that. And they won't get too tall either, which look great. And they're so tolerant of so many different conditions. So kind of the dry shade. And as you kind of get into the damper side, how damp is it? Is it like really damp?
Yeah, like it drains. There's a field and it drains right to that point. So there is one part of it that's very damp.
So like the very damp side, you've got things like the ostrich ferns.
Okay.
Which produce a lovely colony, and if they're happy, they'll kind of spread. And they're pretty good at competing there with the birch roots in that respect. Yeah, but that'll be your damper sort of spot, and they'd only go as far as it's kind of viable for them. If it gets too dry, then they won't go into that sort.
They won't spread further. Yeah.
Right. And of course, you've got the hostas there in the damper spot there as well.
Yeah,
do very, very well.
And I have a couple there, and they are doing very well. Yeah. So, but
you can mix in some taller ferns in there as well. So like, is it sort of a limey soil there, or are you kind of more acid? Or
no, it'd be a neutral soil. Yeah,
it's neutral, perfect.
Yeah.
So I mean, the some of the royal ferns that the ostrich ferns does. The royal fern, the osmunders.
Yeah,
they do really well. So that gives you a little bit of height there as well. Plenty of options.
Yeah, just to step back a small bit. So we're talking about a lot of ferns here, and you mentioned at the very start that you don't like tree ferns personally. I wouldn't chance growing them here. I'm very much inland, quite cold, quite late frosts, and I'm sure with lots of minding I could look after them, but I just I'm not too much into that sort of wrapping them up type of thing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But just to talk about the types of ferns maybe first. I know we're sort of going backwards here a little bit, but I'm conscious that you're talking about a lot of different fern types here, and I'm certainly not aware of some of them, and I know some of the listeners mightn't be. So maybe just an overview of the types of ferns as well.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, just kind of the range you have there. You're starting off with your native ferns.
Mm-hmm.
So things like the Droptis dilatata, which is the buckler fern.
Okay.
And you'll see that growing in kind of like, if you get wet woodlands or by streams, that sort of thing, they'll grow the really fresh green foliage.
Yeah, they're beautiful.
And they'll kind of generally die down in the winter. Sometimes they keep their front, but usually they die down. You have your lady ferns, which would be the Ethereums, and they're totally deciduous. And again, you'll see them in woodlands. They'll have generally kind of quite delicate sort of fronds, delicate looking fronds. They're pretty tough, kind of greens, maybe into reds as well. And then your male ferns, things like the Droptis Phalanx Mastinaffinus we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And they're your typical shuttlecock type shaped ferns, and the soft shield ferns like the Polystick and Satyriferum. Just one point there, what I'll say about the male and female ferns. One question I do get asked is, do you need both?
Okay.
And the answer is no. They're completely different species. But it goes back to kind of Victorian misogyny, when the lady ferns are quite sort of delicate looking.
Right.
And the male ferns are kind of much more stronger, more robust looking. So that's how that comes across.
Okay, so you don't need both like you would with a fruit tree or whatever, or
exactly, yeah.
certain hollies and so on.
Yeah. Once you start getting onto the reproductive side of ferns, it's like a really different matter. It's just kind of very complex, but great fun.
Yeah, I'd imagine. So when we talk about housing estates then, and that shade that you're talking about now, where a lot of the garden is shaded for a lot of the day, and you have various types of shade within that. What's the best approach there? Maybe talk about some of the plants that we could use there. And I'm sure there's probably ones that are very good for pots that will give some people a little bit more flexibility.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, container growing is brilliant.
Yeah.
You're controlling the compost, your medium there. So if you have got sort of like a typical back garden there where it's mostly builder rubble and whatever stuff they've thrown onto it, containers are brilliant until you kind of rectify the soil issues there in the garden. But say now, all ferns grow really, really well in containers.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah, love those conditions. As long as you have the drainage right. It's like with any container, really. You have to just make sure that any drainage holes are free and doesn't get blocked. Because I know people think ferns like really damp, wet conditions and that, but they don't, with few exceptions. Most of them prefer that kind of really sort of free draining sort of soil. It's one of those things when I put it on pretty much all of the labels, I think it has on there a moisture retentive, well-drained soil. And it sounds a bit like an oxymoron, but it isn't.
Yeah, you're talking about organic matter, really.
Exactly. It basically holds that moisture, but you still need any excess moisture to move out. You don't want it to stagnate there or anything like that. So with the containers, yeah. So any ferns, obviously the hostas are brilliant in containers. They do really well.
Yeah.
And heucheras, again, it's just making sure you can get water in them. So brilliant. What you can use is the hanging basket little gel things.
Oh yeah,
water that sort of helps. So if you're ever going to leave them from any period of time, if you're going on holiday, that'll kind of give them a good chance.
Just keep the moisture in it. Yeah, and potting mix is something we would have talked about on the podcast on several occasions. But I guess you're talking about a mixture of compost, farmyard manure, soil.
Yeah, well rotted farm manure.
Yeah.
You don't want it fresh because that's going to destroy the roots of them. That's one thing they don't like, is that sort of like kind of really sort of acid burns, if you like, from new manure. So really well rotted, more well rotted, better. And leaf mold as well is never good one.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. Yeah. On the just going back again to an episode I covered a couple of weeks ago on vine weevil and heucheras. Heucheras are one of the major casualties of vine weevil. How are you managing that situation?
What we do is we use nematodes.
Oh, you're using nematodes. Brilliant.
So we do that twice a year.
Okay.
And they sort of control it really, really well.
Yeah. So you're doing like a May and a September application, probably.
Yeah,
something
pretty much when the soil temperature gets warm enough. So when you want the soil temperature above really 10 degrees centigrade, ideally. Yeah. And then sort of later in the autumn, before it sort of falls below that kind of level. So yeah, around that September's kind of around the best sort of times. The interesting with nematodes is you'll find is that as the temperature drops, their effectiveness drops right down, and you might notice if there's any vine weevils, late kind of laying ones, they might sort of start coming up. That does happen with the grubs, but then the temperatures warm up again, the nematodes then sort of hammer them back down again. Okay. So, yeah, again, it's not 100%. I mean, you're always going to get survivors. Any sort of biological control, you always get a few, but it stops them becoming a nuisance anyway. Yeah,
that's good. It's good actually to hear you saying that, because as I said, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I covered an episode on vine weevils at the request of a listener, and I spoke about biological control. But it's like all these things when someone talks about it, but when you hear somebody who's using it regularly and getting good success, I think that sort of validates it even a little bit more, and someone who's doing it commercially as well, which as I say, it validates it a little bit more. We've sort of talked about a good few plants here, but sort of categorize or talk about maybe the best-selling plants that you have, and talk about, because I know you're doing hostas, you're doing ferns, but maybe talk about all the different types of plants and the possibilities, because there's some we haven't mentioned at all. I know, like, you have cyclamens, and there's certain types of geranium, and there's epimediums and others. So maybe just talk about the other plants as well, and where they would fit in.
Okay, we suppose we could start at this time of year. Yeah. Okay, so now at the moment, let's just say epimediums now are kind of like really coming to flower. We have a few anemones, not many. Sorry, the hellebores, sorry, but we don't have too many of those. But they're kind of flowering now, and then you'll be getting on next to the real sort of like the start of the fern season. When all the things are really coming up. So now, very, very soon now, we come like ostrich ferns. When people see them growing by the size, it's kind of like, wow, they want them. Yeah. So we have those. We also have the American one as well, the variety Pennsylvanica, which is would be the variety which the Americans love to eat. They're fiddleheads, but right. That's a different story. Yeah, you have to cook them properly, and you have to get the coils just when they're really tightly coiled. Yeah. And maybe mix, say, 1 or 2 centimeters of the stem and cut them off, and then you can eat them like asparagus. Wow. I haven't tried it myself, but Americans love it. So yeah, so they'll begin to say best selling around that period would be the ostrich ferns. Then as you're sort of getting through the year into May, things like some of the male ferns will be coming up. Now, Dropterus affinis you'll see on the roadsides, the real kind of golden color. Yeah. Not fabulous. They'll start being one of the best sellers. Dropterus wallaceiana, it's a Japanese, really large fern, but absolutely beautiful golden croziers, much with black, and they'll just come up and look absolutely spectacular. And of course, hostas will be starting to come in force then as well. And so, depending on people's likes, I wouldn't say there's any one particular one bestseller. I've got one of those blue mouses. That's the little small kind of grey blue little fella. But there's a lot more besides this. I mean, some of the fresh green ones are gorgeous, just to give that structure.
The differences in the leaves, I think, in hostas. So the difference in color, the difference in size, the difference in texture, always is fascinating. Yeah. And if you see somebody who has a lot of hostas and they have them grouped or in pots that are grouped,
And then many of them are very kind of like slug resistant as well.
Oh, there is slug resistant ones, is there?
Because say now, Summon Substance would be a good one.
Right.
It's one we grow a lot here in the garden, especially once they get to a certain size. So you can protect them when they're younger. And then once they get to such size, they can pretty much look after themselves. You still get the odd holes in.
Yeah.
If you don't use any sort of protection. Just for slug protection in the nursery, just use the organic slug pellets.
Yeah, organic ferric phosphate,
exactly,
basically. Yeah.
So rather than actually being a toxic or such, they just kind of dehydrate the slugs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's a huge variety of hostas, massive variety of them.
And geraniums, I know there's not a big selection, but there's a couple of flowering geraniums that can be used in shaded areas.
Exactly, yeah, they're very good in dry shade as well. Yeah, they're just kind of, yeah, they seem to grow virtually anywhere as long as it's not too wet. I mean, they hate damp, so a lot of them sort of rot. But I think they'll away quite happily as well, which is nice.
Yeah, I think the thing with shaded areas is that people generally have, you know, if they're planting up a perennial border, they have high expectations of what that border is going to become and the color blast that they can get. But they typically have low expectations of shaded areas. But there is amazing possibilities actually, but I just think people are maybe unaware of them.
There's one lovely plant if we want to try something which is really way out there. It's one of the what we call the aroids, and basically these are kind of tuberous perennials.
Yeah.
And there's one fabulous one, and you kind of looking at it, you think, how on earth would it survive in the garden? And that's it's called Dracunculus vulgaris.
Okay. I'm not familiar with
Dragon arum. And the inflorescence of it must be the biggest of any hardy plants you can grow in Ireland, which would be about that sort of size, the inflorescence.
Okay.
But they'll grow to about 4 foot, these plants.
Wow. The
foliage is amazing. They're coming up now. The ones in the garden actually started coming up about 3 weeks ago. And we've got them growing in lots of different shady spots here. As long as they're not sitting in moisture, they're fine.
Mm-hmm.
But we've even got one in a pot with hostas, and it's coming up beautifully now. But it's just, yeah, they are so spectacular. At the moment now, you've got like an arrow. It's almost like that sort of shape, arrow of green coming from the top. And this will just keep going up. The leaves, many of them are quite mottled, little bits mottled, little marking, stripes, that sort of thing. And then you get the big inflorescence coming up. And it's a purple color.
Wow. Now,
this comes with a warning. I mean, obviously, with something so good, there must be something kind of slightly miss about it. And in this case, it has to have a kind of a noticeable odor. Because they don't use your kind of nicely sweet little honeybees for pollination or the nice delicate butterflies. They prefer to use things like flies, beetles, that sort of thing. Anything which is attracted to rotting flesh.
Oh, so it's that sort of a smell.
It looks like a big kind of gaping wound, hence the size and the color.
Yeah.
But for about 48 hours, you do get a smell. Now, don't tell anyone, but I'm hoping there's going to be some that will be at bloom. So should be interesting anyway. I'll put those in a few strategic locations, I think.
Yeah, you'll have to get a bottle of Dior and leave it beside it or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're amazing plants, and like I said, they'll grow anywhere where you have the drainage and that. But the foliage of themselves is just amazing.
Okay. So we've kind of touched on a lot of the areas now. And we started to get into it a little bit. But your top sellers, what are the plants that everybody wants for shaded areas? The top 3 or 4. Obviously, ferns are up there. You've spoken with them a lot. What else have we got? Is there anything that we've missed out on?
That's kind of like different types of ferns, because we have quite a large variety of them anyway.
Yeah.
So good beginners ferns, we sound like the Dryopteris erythrosora, which is the rosy buckler fern.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is lovely evergreen, but it's almost like ever colourful, because in the sort of late spring, early summer, new fronds will come up and they'll be kind of red and oranges.
Okay.
And then they'll go through to yellow, then to green, and they'll stay green all the way through to the autumn, when they kind of go back to sort of that yellow green.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll stay like that all through the winter and until the new bits and pieces come up, and it grows virtually anywhere. So for a bit of colour, a bit of interest, that's one of our best sellers there. other ones like the drop to Spoiliciana I mentioned earlier because it's so dramatic. Really good. With the hostas, there's no particular clear runaway winner with them because, again, having such a big variety, everyone's got their slightly different tastes of color and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the hostas sell very well, especially in the summer.
Yeah, but you have 60 varieties, as
60,
I said.
Yeah, there'll be a few more coming on the website as they kind of become available.
Very good. So, and like hostas, as you said earlier, they do brilliantly in pots, and they are really gorgeous in pots, especially when grouped together. You can get you know with different height pots and then different style leaves or different colored leaves. You can get really dramatic effect.
Exactly
from hostas.
Yeah, exactly. Again, you can actually use them as a foil for other plants as well. You can mix them around if you like. But the great thing about containers, of course, if you are in an area which is particularly heavy in mollusks, slugs and snails, then you can protect them a lot more easily.
Yeah,
if they're in a container. But yeah, hostas go great with ferns as well. Some of the larger ferns, and because the hostas die down in the winter, if you have a good evergreen fern in there, say ones that don't get too big, so something like a Polystichum neolabatum, or there's one called spiny holly, both kind of similar Asian ferns, but lovely glossy evergreen foliage.
Yep.
And they look fabulous. They'll just give you kind of a bit of interest before the hostas come up. And of course, spring bulbs. Put some of those into the container as well.
Yeah.
And they've got the benefit now because the leaves will start coming up. They'll hide the foliage of the daffodils and whatever ones you're using as they're dying down. So it's they're kind of symbiotic in many ways.
Oh yeah, nice idea. Yeah. Once the hosta's fully opened up, you can kind of hide down the ugly daffodil leaves and so on underneath. Yeah. That makes sense. To go back for a second, we mentioned tree ferns, and I know you sell tree ferns, and you did say you don't particularly like them. I didn't ask you why.
I'll just clarify. Clarify that. Well, one thing, when we started up the nursery, I mean, the kind of like our golden rule we would never break was that we'd never sell anything from the wild.
Okay.
Ever. And the problem with the trunked tree ferns is they are taken from the wild.
Okay.
I have a link on the website just to some guys there in Tasmania. And it's really sort of trying to protect their kind of forest there.
Okay.
You have some really ancient, going back onto like Gondwana land type forests, which have been kind of destroyed, for timber and also for the tree ferns.
Okay.
A lot of ones think they're kind of like a waste product, and that's how it used to be. But now, even though the kind of areas of land which are being deforested in Australia is reducing, the number of tree ferns being taken out is actually pretty much the same, if not increasing a little bit.
Right.
So there's kind of selection of woodland that's been taken account, especially the high prices now with tree ferns. But we do sell Dixonias, but they're all spore grown.
Okay.
So of course they take a long time to kind of get going at any of that sort of sizes there. So they're kind of really grown more for the fabulous sort of foliage. And in certainly milder parts of the country, it's not really a great issue for protecting them. But sure, in the kind of more central and northern parts, you would have to, which you would anyway with the trumped ones. But
yeah, that makes sense. I wondered why you were saying that about tree ferns, but yeah, it is totally logical that if there's an area where that's being pillaged essentially to feed the gardening world with these tree ferns, then that's not a good thing to be doing, for sure.
Yeah, I know. It's just one of those kind of like we see gardening presenters, especially in the UK, that's sort of kind of going about not using peat or anything like that, and then they're kind of like, it's a lovely tree fern. Okay, fine.
You're looking for a bit of balance. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. Not judging or anything like that, but that's just my own personal.
Yeah, no, but it makes sense because you're talking about a balanced conversation. Then peat on the one hand, or a tree fern that's been taken from somewhere and come halfway around the world. I understand exactly what you're getting at. My question was coming around to this though. Tree ferns, the reason I wouldn't touch them here personally is just we're quite cold, and I just wouldn't be into the minding and that sort of wrapping up and all the rest of it. Am I correct in saying that a lot of the native ferns are hardy anyway, but a lot of the other ferns are very hardy? Am I correct in saying that, or is there certain ones?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, virtually every fern that we sell here would be classed as hardy.
Okay.
There are a few which about to sell during the summer, which would be more for house for the plants, but they're kind of their own sort of particular niche, if you like. There,
yeah.
But there's some of the more of the more exotic ones, which are kind of like half sort of tender, if you like. Things like there's one called the Dahlia, which is a creeping fern, which has very hairy rhizomes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like sometimes called the rabbit's paw fern, that sort of thing. And they'll survive actually outside if they're kept sheltered from the rain. They'll tolerate frost quite easily, but it's just that combination of wet and rain. Again, we've got some New Zealand ones there, brake ferns or the Pelea. They'll grow fine outside, lovely evergreen sort of plants, but if they kind of get wet or anything like that, they'll suffer quite a lot and probably die as a result of that. So yeah, it's that kind of that balance between kind of moisture and cold. You don't want them to dry out, otherwise that'll kill them, but you don't want them to get wet either.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
But yeah, but on the majority of the ferns, and the vast majority, are all perfectly hardy that we sell. Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
think
what we want to do is have lots of ferns, with ground ferns, which you couldn't buy, which are hardy ground ferns. That was our main thing.
And I think for most people, what they're looking for is that look, that canopy look.
Jungle-like.
Yeah, jungle-like. And like all ferns will give you that. The tree fern obviously gives you that extra bit of height and I suppose the umbrella type canopy, but you get that look from all of the other ferns as well. So it's possible even if you're in a really cold spot or windy spot like what I would be here.
Absolutely, you can get really lovely looks there. The great thing about ferns is they all kind of go really well together.
Yeah.
They always have that kind of like mathematical symmetry about them, which sort of means, and you put two different ferns together, they always seem to look well.
Yeah.
But if you wanted a jungle look, then you just mix that with some of the larger leaf plants. Like some of the hostas would be ideal with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's hardy begonias that we have there as well, which grow surprisingly hardy, amazingly hardy. They grow well. So yeah, different types of leaf types, but especially that kind of the fern-shaped ones, lovely large round leaves, and then different types of ones mixed down. Put some bamboos in or something like that. If you get nice clumping ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So any sort of garden, you can get that sort of effect really, quite easily. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Before we start to round off, cyclamens is one that look beautiful. We didn't speak about it all, so just maybe tell us a little bit about what you have in cyclamens. And like again, as I said earlier, people can be surprised, pleasantly surprised, because they don't have much of an expectation in terms of color from a shaded area, but with hellebores, with some of the geraniums, with cyclamens, you can get great color at different times of the year. Springtime, particularly, actually. Yeah,
because we have two types of cyclamen, because I love the white flowers. I mean, so because another thing we do is we do little little garden designs, like little border designs.
Okay.
So we do little maps, little kind of almost like planting by numbers.
Okay.
So cyclamen is something we use a fair bit in that. But we've got two types. You've got the cyclamen coum and the cyclamen hederifolium, both really hardy. So you usually plant both of them in gardens, different areas, because they flower at different times.
Yeah.
But now you're getting your cyclamen coum to be in flower, and then later on will be the hederifoliums, kind of like for the autumn, the winter there. But yeah, they have the lovely white flowers. They get bigger. The leaves get quite nice and large as well.
Yeah, and
one thing, if you like that cyclamen looking leaf, but you want it to be more evergreen, then there's a lovely plant, another type of aroid, which is the asarum. It's like a
never heard of it.
Yeah, it's this one, Asarum splendens, and it has that lovely, almost cyclamen-like foliage.
Okay.
It kind of creeps along. It doesn't have the flowers as such, but what it does have is like about this time of year, they're flowering like kind of small purple type things, and they're pollinated by beetles and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's just another interesting one for like a mat forming cyclamen type leaf.
Yeah, you've sort of half answered the last question. If somebody has a shaded area, and as we said, you can get plants for shaded areas in most garden centres, but not necessarily specialist. you being a specialist, and I know the plant fairs because I've been to them. I see queues at your stand. So chances are, if somebody rocks up at a plant fair, they're not going to get. You're not going to be able to give them much time to explain a bed and so on. So what's the best approach? Somebody has an area in their back garden at the side of their house. What's the best approach to come to you and end up with a planted area that's going to look great? Is it draw out the area, map it out, and then approach you through the website, or how what's the
just you can do that through the website. Just kind of contact us by the website, and all you need basically is just the area of the site. Show you a couple of photographs are brilliant, just so you can get an idea of what's growing.
Yeah, a bit of perspective.
Go with it, yeah. And then what we'll do then is just put together like a little planting scheme, just a very simple one.
Yeah.
So basically just put in kind of like different colored shapes for the different type of plants. So it's like a planting by numbers type thing.
Yeah.
And so all the plants are labeled, so you just kind of put plants there, and that should do it. So it works pretty well. We're really happy with the response. People have tried it, have always been very happy. So
that makes sense, because
it's an easy thing to do, because people do get kind of a little bit sort of like, whoa, there's just so much choice. Who's going to do a little bit overwhelming. So
because as I was having a look on your website earlier, like there is a phenomenal amount of plants, and as you said, there's various types of shades within that, and so to make sure that they're getting the right plants for the right area, that's a good route to go. Before we go, your website is, if you tell us where your web, they'll find you anyway, Shady Plants, but it's shadyplants.net. .ie.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, or shadyplants.net, either works.
Okay, either works. So yeah, shadyplants. And you'll be visiting all the plant fairs, or pretty much all of the plant fairs this year, will you?
Yeah, it's starting 2 weeks time this weekend. So the first one we're doing there will be at Cabinteely for the Dublin Alpine Garden Society show. I love doing that one. It's just brilliant. And then the next day, how we're going to do it, I'm not quite sure, but we're going to Clare Galway on the Sunday after. So
wow. So
yes, that's kind of like the start of the. There's one show which I'll be doing the Ulster AGS, and then the next day I'll be in Cork photo. So
wow,
it'll be an interesting one.
Yeah, so keep an eye out. Irish Specialist Nursery Producers.
The Irish Specialist Nursery Association, isna.ie.
Yeah.
They're all the plant fairs there.
You keep an eye out for the plant fairs, and then you'll find out which nurseries are attending and so on. Mike, it's been really interesting. I think we could probably talk for hours and hours on this. I think people will find it obviously very interesting, but they'll find a little bit of hope in it, because most people write off those very shaded areas, or a lot of people write off those very shaded areas. So I think that will give them hope that there is always a plant for that area. On top of that, the fact that it doesn't have to be drab, you can get color in there, I think will excite people a little bit. So thank you very, very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast, and it's been really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's been this week's episode. Huge thanks to Mike for coming on. It's an episode that we've been trying to link up for a while. It's one that is requested quite often. So shaded areas are an area that people maybe struggle a little bit, but after listening to that, I don't think there's any great reason for that. So I suppose we don't always know that there is as many different types of shaded areas, and that there is a plant for each one of those. So I think, check out Mike's website and keep an eye out for the plant fairs during the year, and you'll be able to get that area looking great this year. That's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.